Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for our next Learn Live session, Manage AI Workloads in a Center of Excellence. My name is Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be professional, mindful of your commentary, and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenters to answer. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand right here on the Microsoft Reactor page. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our presenters for today. Thank you all so much for joining us.
G'day viewers, Oren here, and I'm here with Ben and Sonia, and today we're going to be talking about how an AI Center of Excellence can work with and advise workload teams when it comes to running AI workloads. So I'm Oren, I'm in Melbourne. Ben, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Soren. And nice to see you again, Sonia. My name is Ben Brower. I am a senior product marketing manager, and I focus on the well-architected framework, the cloud adoption framework, and Azure Architecture Center, specifically around AI workloads. So I thought I would join and crash the party here.
Yeah, absolutely, more than welcome, Ben. And hello, everybody. I'm Sonia, coming from Brisbane, Australia. Oren and I have both got very long experience with running traditional workloads, both on-prem and in the cloud. So we're really interested in how this all works in the age of AI applications now.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about how an AI Center of Excellence can really assist, manage, and advise organizations' workload teams on managing their AI workloads. We're going to talk to you about something called GenAI Ops, which you may or you may not have heard of before. We'll talk about how an AI Center of Excellence can assist sort of determining what appropriate AI workload architectural and infrastructure best practices should be used by workload teams, and how the workload teams can provide feedback on whether or not those best practices work in production. We also will talk about AI workload deployment best practices and how an AI COE can help with sort of setting those. We'll talk about how an AI COE can talk about setting guardrails for AI workloads, and also the AI COE's sort of position when it comes to organizational responsibilities around compliance and AI governance. So the first thing we want to sort of hit in this general list of topics is, what is the role of an AI COE in workload operations? Sonia, what do you think about what's on this slide here?
Yeah, well, I think it kind of ties back to what I mentioned in terms of taking our traditional experience running workloads, but bringing in the expertise on these new workload types. Because I can tell you a good architecture for a cloud application. I can tell you how to make it resilient and how to monitor it, back it up, do all those things that we do with these traditional workloads. But what I am lacking a little bit on is, what does it mean when an AI model goes off the rails? Like, what are some of the specifics around things like large language models that are going to have an impact on my application? So it's kind of melding, I think, this experience between what I know is good practices for all of the things around an application, but also bringing in these specific AI experiences, and then being able to have that communicated across my organization, because there's a good chance that it's not just one centralized team that's going to be building your AI applications. You've probably got people in the business that are using third-party GenAI solutions. So how do you make sure that there's some guidance around that use as well? So let's bring in all of those different components, come up with the best practices for our organization, and make sure that's communicated across all of the teams that are using these AI applications.
So that's really something that we're trying to get across in this particular session, that you can, or an organization that's adopting AI, and we're all sort of in this new phase of we're adopting AI. We don't know the best way to actually do this at this particular point in time. So what we're trying to do is we're getting some very prescriptive knowledge that we might be pulling from somewhere on the internet, our own guidance that we provide at Microsoft. You might be looking at the guidance of other vendors. But there's the guidance that comes from external, and then there's the wisdom that you have learned by people actually deploying these workloads in production, and what they've actually learned by stubbing their toe against the workload in production. So one of the things about an AI COE is it can sort of reach down into those teams or work with those teams, not only to provide prescriptive guidance, but also learn from those teams about, actually, this is what happened when we took your advice, mate, and this is where it went wrong, so that we can distribute that elsewhere. Ben, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, one of the things that we've done with the well-architected framework is we developed some guidance around the operational excellence pillar that focuses on GenAIOps. And we also take into account MLOps, because the two are different. And it's important to realize the differences. So in that guidance, what we have in the AI workload or the WAF for AI workload, we talk about those differences and how to think about them within a pillar, this operational excellence pillar. And then we relate it to the center of excellence, the purpose of a center of excellence, because the center of excellence should take into account all the different workloads, the guidance of those workloads, but maybe be specific given the workload type. So when we think about GenAIOps, it's taking into account another nuance that you would not necessarily see in MLOps because of the differences in the way that the data is gathered and used. The model that is. I think there's also a lot of information there that comes from these different workload types that then influence how the center of excellence is used.
So one of the other elements of having a center of excellence is sort of as parental supervision for AI workload teams. And it's not that AI workload, not that you need parental supervision, but one of the things that every organization knows is that adage, which is something that became as an experiment in development, somehow became a critical production workload. And what an AI center of excellence can do, or at least having one, or at least there being some sort of V team there that's taking this oversight for all of these elements of AI workload operations, is the idea that if you're going to go and deploy one of these workloads, let's make sure that off the bat, it's actually well architected. So, Sonia, what are the elements that you think of when when you're looking at this and you're thinking about what you'd be advising if you were on an AI COE, what you'd be advising a workload team in terms of thinking about with architecture when it came to the AI workloads?
Yeah, there's some good points on the slide that you've brought up on screen, Aaron. I think reliability and performance is something that we naturally think of when we think of operating any workload, right? But what does that mean in the context of AI? Are there other sort of technologies or architecture components that we need to make sure are introduced to ensure the reliability and the performance of these types of applications? And then we've also got things like security considerations and cost efficiency. Again, concepts that are very well known in the industry if you are managing other workloads already, but applying this stuff to AI is definitely a big consideration. And I think it's also about getting the people that have the knowledge and the understanding of the details of the different types of AI services to see what they need to do to be in alignment with your organization's needs from an architecture perspective as well. So what do they need to have in place to ensure that you're meeting any security requirements that your organization has, especially if you are in a highly regulated industry? And then how does an AI application generate cost? How are we monitoring that? How do we know that the money we're spending on that application is giving us a good return on our investment? How do we know that it's optimized to both be performant, but also not blow costs out of the water unnecessarily? So lots of traditional concepts that we're applying now to AI technologies.
And one of the things that you'll see when you're adopting AI workloads into your operations is generally the people that are working on these workload teams have been working on other workloads for a long time. They will have a lot of wisdom and knowledge and hard-won understanding of all of these elements. As Sonia said, reliability, security, performance optimization, and cost efficiency isn't anything new to anybody. It's just taking everything that you've learned and making sure that it is able to apply to these new types of workloads, and making sure that you're taking your organizational wisdom and applying them and using an AI COE as a distribution point. But Ben's also worked on Microsoft's website. We've got a whole lot of stuff published up there that really takes what Microsoft's learned. Ben, would you like to talk a little bit more about where people can get guidance around these elements here?
Sure. Yeah, I think going back to the well-architected framework, there's some really good guidance there, and the framework itself is a very good way to apply well-architected principles to an AI workload, because yes, each one of these are pillars: the reliability, security, performance, and cost efficiency, and operational excellence. Those are all 5 pillars of the well-architected framework. But one of the things that you get from that framework is a trade-off mechanism. You can really trade off between security and reliability, for instance. You can really think about the specific recommendations in cost as it relates to reliability. And so that the guidance there is prescriptive, it's opinionated in nature. And so using it that way, it gives you a much better sense for how Microsoft would go about architecting a workload. The guidance there is meant to give you a very good understanding of Microsoft's perspective on it.
And one of the things that Ben just brought up that's really interesting about any of these sort of architectural guidance is this idea of what your trade-offs are. And the more reliable you make a workload, like you can build in so many levels of redundancy, but each level of redundancy that you build into a workload is going to increase the cost of running that workload. And that what an AI COE can do, because remember when we talked about in last week, is we talked about this idea that the AI COE was there to also make sure that these workloads that we were deploying were really meeting business objectives. And it's the COE then can assist, or at least take the flak for figuring out exactly where the balance of that trade-off is about, we're going to be this reliable, but it's going to cost us this much. And the business might go, you know what, mate, we don't need you to be that reliable where it's going to cost that much money. So we'll accept this level of failure probability, or, offline probability for this particular cost. On this next slide, we're talking about when the AI COE is looking at the responsibilities around these workloads, that one of the big ones from an organizational level, because, you don't want your executives to have to be in a courtroom answering nasty questions about why something hasn't happened. And one of the ones is making sure that you're secure and compliant, that your AI workloads have appropriate security measures, and that when we're talking about compliance from the start, someone's got to go out and do the research and figure out what regulation applies to your AI workloads. And what are some of the factors that influence that, Sonia?
I was actually just going to ask Ben a question when you brought that up, because when I see that slide, I'm thinking about what I'm used to implementing from security and compliance in an application, but I'm not sure how that translates to AI. So obviously, I don't want people putting data into AI models that's like sensitive data into public AI systems. But how do I stop that? Is it a case of using something like Microsoft Purview to make sure that my data is classified? Like, this is kind of it's a slightly different territory for me. So Ben, do you have any sort of good overviews, or maybe a couple of examples of how things like security and compliance could actually be managed in the context of an AI workload.
Yeah, well, yes, and it's a big question. We could go on.
Depends, right? The answer is it depends.
Session here. And one of the interesting things about AI is generative AI is that you're generating new data, and so you're not just dealing with the data that it's the data that is going to be built based on what you already have. And so there's two new, very new dimensions to the way you think about securing and making your data compliant. So that's the first thing I would say, is to be aware that this is going to happen. The second is the policy that you end up using and the tagging of the data that you use to create or apply the policy is a best practice. It's something you should be doing with all of your data anyway. You can do this in Purview, Microsoft Purview. You can do this in other systems also. And so the purpose here is just to have a maintenance model that allows you to ensure compliance. So how you go about doing that, it really depends on your organization, which gets back to Oren's point of this is an organization-wide governance principle. And so I would start there, and the way you go about applying that principle will depend on the tooling you have. Also, how you go about managing your subscriptions in your environments. But again, that's a very big question, so I'll stop there. What's your perspective? How would you go about it?
Sonia, you're on mute.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It comes down to that combination of business requirements and what tools you have. And I like going back to a point that you made at the start of the session, where you were talking about, hang on a minute, AI is not just one thing. So it's very hard to also give a definitive answer based on, if you have AI in your organization, this is what you should do, because not only does it depend on what your organization needs, but it really does come down to those actual specifics of, what does this AI application look like, or what is the use of AI in my organization? I like that that's kind of the next level of detail, to get down and have a look at what the capabilities are of those workload specifics.
So on this next slide, we're looking at the idea of how an AI COE can come up with some sort of sensibility or reasonability about what your monitoring best practices are. And what this comes down to is every workload team has things that they monitor, but to the organization, there's going to be certain things that are important and certain things that are irrelevant. Whenever you go and look at one of these monitoring graphs or one of these monitoring outputs or event logs or whatever, you've got certain things that you're looking for and certain things that you don't care about. One of the things that an AI COE can make sure that workload teams are aware of is, look, this is what we think you should be monitoring for these particular AI workloads. And that gets refined also, because when there are anomalous events, when there's things that go wrong, that's when you're doing your analysis of what goes wrong, that's where you're coming back and going, well, actually, we needed to actually go and figure out, we should have been looking at this sort of thing as well. This was something that we weren't tracking. This is something that we should track. Do we have, Ben, do we have guidance up on learn.microsoft.com about what to monitor, or do we sort of leave that up to individual organizations?
No, we definitely make suggestions. There's definitely prescriptive guidance out there about what you should monitor, how you should monitor, and more specific things around content safety for AI. So I think there are some really important constructs that and principles that customers should evaluate, and then determine what works best for them in their environments. Because there's actually, as Sonia pointed out, when you're dealing with highly regulated environments, you're going to have additional sets of content or monitoring you'll need to do. So as far as where to go for this content, there's a couple of places for monitoring, for prescriptive guidance for sure, and that's in our operational excellence pillar. There's just the general WAF pillar for operational excellence. And then there's some specific guidance for AI workloads that you can find in the WAF. And then finally, for some specific areas for some specific services, like for Azure OpenAI, for instance, you can find specific service guidance on how to go about monitoring those particular services that are used within your workload. My point being is that there's multiple places to go. It just depends on the precision you need.
And that's one of the things that a COE can actually do, is that the COE can actually go and do that research legwork and go and find all of those sources and then make and distill all of that massive panoply of information into guidance that workload teams that don't necessarily have the time to go out and do that research into. This is our organizational level guidance. So also think about a COE in terms of the group that's actually being aware of everything that's external and internal and trying to synthesize that. Whereas your workload teams that are being guided or interacting with the COE are going, okay, we're getting what is important. We're getting what's been distilled from all of the people that are doing the consulting, researching and understanding of everything that's out there, and then trying to distill it down to what's actually important to our organization. Okay, so the next topic that we want to talk about is this idea of GenAI Ops and how the AI COE can really recommend that a specific set of processes around generative AI be adopted by the organization. Now, Ben, you know a bit about GenAI Ops. Can you give us a sort of a high-level overview of how it works, what it is, what it's different from, we know we should be rubbing DevOps on it, as Donovan would have said, but sort of tell us a bit more about what GenAI Ops is.
Yeah, sure. So first, it is a cousin to or a derivative of DevOps, and so if you have a DevOps team already, this shouldn't be that far off from what you're already doing. This is really meant to help you understand how to manage AI ops or AI workloads better, and so there's just some specific things you need to do or think about what in terms of your DevOps environment or your DevOps processes, to point out that there are new personas involved, that there are new considerations in the way you go about maintaining these workloads, the way you think about developing the workload, et cetera. So there is obviously some new nuances within the DevOps process, but want to make that clear. However, when you also think about like data ops, for instance, data ops is actually a really interesting new, I call it new, it's not that new, but it's a new area that actually takes into account both DevOps and data and begins to meld these two processes in a way that you can do something more with your GenAI Ops processes. And so I actually really like this new approach that we're seeing. MLOps took data ops to a new level, but now GenAIOps is taking it even further. So I'll stop there if anyone else has comments.
So one of the things that, especially when you come up with or you encounter a new term like GenAI Ops, is figuring out, okay, do we have to do everything that it sort of says in the cookbook, or do we sort of figure it out ourselves? And it's understanding how to balance sort of what's the prescriptive nature of the methodology that exists there, but looking for what great advice actually can be applied from those processes to your own organization. And that's again where a COE can help, because you'll want someone on the COE who can at least talk about this and then answer questions when someone says, okay, so how do I actually implement that in our production environment? And on this slide, you can see we've sort of broken it down a bit more into things that are a bit more comprehensible in terms of repeatable processes. We've got model accuracy, effective governance, and change management. Now, the repeatable processes, effective government, and change management is things that we've seen across all workloads. What differentiates, and I'll let either of you sort of jump in on this, sustained model accuracy? That's something that's new to this particular process.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this one because I've been thinking about this since the key metrics slide that you had up earlier about accuracy. I don't think I've ever needed to monitor an application for accuracy. Like, that's something that you did with unit testing before you deployed it into production. And you kind of just assume, I mean, maybe there's some checks and balances if it's like purchase order approval application, like things like that tend to get coded once and developed once, and then they maintain their level of accuracy. It's really like a bug or an update or something where you're going to start to get unexpected results inside an application. So I think those applications have been fairly stable. But with AI, that model accuracy and the accuracy of the output of the application is really super important. And how do you make sure that that continues to be good? Like, are you just relying on people hitting the downvote button and the product feedback to go, well, that wasn't a correct answer? I love that. I think all of this sort of GenAI Ops to me feels like all the things that you need to do inside the application, as opposed to some of the more traditional concepts of change management or security, those kind of things that may happen outside or under the infrastructure of the application. But this GenAI Ops to me really feels like this is the stuff that I need to be caretaking and looking after inside the application on an ongoing basis.
If you're having a little trouble getting your head around this, one of the ways to think about it is as follows. Traditional workloads are what we call deterministic. That is, you've got a set of inputs and then you've got a fixed set of inputs giving a fixed set of outputs. With an AI application, the output is probabilistic. That is, for a fixed set of inputs, you might get a different or a spectrum or a range or a bell curve of outputs. Ben, do you have any good stories about where model accuracy has been a problem or where someone's noticed the accuracy of a model degrade?
Oh goodness, I have stories. Let me think. So first of all, I think a really important part to the discussion here when it comes to model accuracy is understanding your use case and also having your domain experts in the workload team providing the guidance so that when it comes to model accuracy, it truly has that high fidelity. So making sure that use case is understood and understanding that the domain expert is involved. That I think is kind of a newer set of capabilities that need to be on the team. That said, interesting story. So I think one of the most interesting stories I heard was when there. Oh, goodness. It just escaped me. I'm going to let it go because I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. But yeah, if there was a different one, I'll have to think about it. Sorry about that.
And it'll probably come back to you. So feel free to sort of interrupt with the story later on, because that's one of the best ways of illustrating these concepts is really talking about real life stories. And because this field is so new, there isn't the great war stories you hear about, the disasters that have occurred that when you've got 20 years of operations experience or more, you can tell some real great stories about what we call resume generating events. The other thing that is part of this is the idea of model selection and refinement. And I know on social media, and I think I saw where where this was generated was that I think GitHub put up a post talking about all of the different models available from Anthropic, Google, and OpenAI, and how you actually selected the right model. And this is actually kind of a fairly critical thing, because even if you're using GenAI just in the chatbot sense, choosing the right model based on what you actually want it to do is really quite a challenge, because there's a lot of things that you've got to balance about speed, token utilization, and accuracy. So the ability to choose the right model for your workload. And then the other thing about workloads is that we know for most organizations, traditionally, you've sort of done a deployment, and then the core elements of your deployment have sort of stayed in place. But how do you choose the right model when we've got the frontier models moving and being regularly iterated? Ben, do you have any ideas about how you even think about that?
I think probably that the way I've seen most customers who have succeeded in this way is they know their use case. That's the first thing, is they know the use case. They know, they have a good sense for what their prompts are, that the main prompts, which would then generate a certain outcome or a certain answer. And if they're not getting those answers, then either they don't have the right model or they don't have enough data in which to train that model. And so in that case, there's a additional work that needs to be done in the way you go about building that model, training that model. But a lot of that's going to end up being dependent on, again, like that domain expert or those subject matter experts are going to need to be involved in that part for sure. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and it's also very challenging and I've seen discussions sort of about this as well, about how much time do you spend fine-tuning a model when we're getting new models coming out sort of on a frequent basis. Like, do you want to spend, it's like getting a new pet and then taking it off to training. And if you're constantly getting a new dog every 3 months, like how often you've got to obviously have the dog trained, right? But if you're replacing your dog, or if you're in a situation where, obviously that analogy's just fallen off a bridge, but that one of these elements that a COE's got to recommend, like at some point you've got to maybe commit to a particular iteration of a model and say, we're going to run this in production for a certain amount of time. Because the other element of this is if you're constantly throwing dev cycles at switching things out and then having to retest all of those things, that is something that is costing your organization money. Every time you touch something to change a knob or a dial does actually turn the meter on the cost of these deployments. So continuous monitoring metrics, we've sort of talked about these, and these are just essential monitoring for performance, cost effectiveness, and anomaly detection, that you really need to be able to see if you are getting, and we talked about this idea in the last sort of session, about the people who decide whether or not it's cost effective aren't necessarily the workload team. That's usually a decision that's made higher up the pole. And then evaluating the performance. Is models getting stale? I know it's something I've seen a lot in the documentation, but when I've been working with AI workloads, things are moving so quickly that I'm pulling stuff out and then putting things in. Have you heard any stories about, models becoming stale in deployment, Ben?
Well, yes. We see it within our own work that we're doing. Whenever there's new content that comes out in skilling, then there needs to be a model refresh. I was just talking to our Azure Architecture Center team about that very question of how do you ensure that as the content is made available, how do you know that the model that the team has available to them is up to date? A lot of that ends up being automated, but then not always. So there needs to be a check or a quality check on the model to make sure that it isn't stale or it has been updated in a timely manner. I've seen that in a number of cases, especially within our own team.
So Ben, is that just a case of training the model on the new data?
Effectively, yeah. That's primarily what I'm describing, is just making sure that the model is constantly updated.
Okay, so the next topic we want to come across is the idea of designing your workloads for reliability and performance. And that's really the COE saying to workload teams, okay, when these things are being conceived, let's make sure that you keep it modular, that you keep it scalable, that you have secure integration points, and that you use something like the well-architected framework. So we've got the well-architected framework and we've got Azure Architecture Center. So Ben, what's the difference between these two if people are going out to look for advice? If they're trying to figure out for where they go about learning about these things, how do they even understand the difference between the well-architected framework and the Azure Architecture Center?
Yeah, the well-architected framework is going to give you general guidance in how to go about architecting your workload. It will make sure that you have kind of checked all the boxes. There are checklists and recommendations that you can use to make sure you haven't overlooked anything. It goes through some of those trade-offs and that we talked about earlier. But what it doesn't necessarily do is give a good sense for what that architecture should be. And so that's where the architecture center comes into play, where there are reference architectures that are going to be very prescriptive in what you add, what sort of components you should have, and what that flow looks like for that given workload. And so those reference architectures tend to be very helpful just to get you started. And that's what it's there for. It's just to get you started, to kind of give you a sense for how this thing should work. What it doesn't do is help you with your specific use case. And that's where we're expecting that the architect, the developer, goes in and tailors that reference architecture for their requirements. And so that becomes more important to then go deeper into like the reference, like into the service guides and go into different product documents that will give you configuration guidance on how to configure this given workload or services for the given workload. And so it becomes, I would start with kind of the broad nature of the well-architected framework, narrowing it down to the reference architecture, and then narrowing it down further into the service configurations of the given services in the architecture.
One of the big challenges I think a lot of organizations are going to have these days is that even though we've got some of this guidance available, the challenge is that at the moment, the number of experienced AI workload architects out there, they're pretty thin on the ground because we don't actually have enough people that have got years of experience architecting these workloads. If someone was, and this is related to the COE can sit there and go, well, I've gone and looked at well-architected framework. I've looked at the principles within well-architected. I've seen the reference architectures. But actually, we don't have enough experience. We've never done this. How do people who are thinking about wanting to train on this, is it just a matter of where do they start? Where do organizations start to find the people that don't exist yet? Or how do they grow the people that don't exist? Andrew, if you want to sort of throw your hat into the ring on this.
I can get started if you like. I'll go really quick because I want to give Sonia some time. Where you go for skilling effectively is the question. There are lots of places to go for skilling. There's a lot of our system integrators, partners. There's a lot of internal references within Microsoft. If you have an account manager, they will give you a lot of good places to go about skilling your workforce, or again, to work with an outside partner. You also have a lot of self-guided content that you can use for skilling. This is actually where like the Learn modules become really important. It's really a great way to get certified for becoming a cloud architect. That cloud architect certification also leads to AI architectures where we're updating those architectures. or that certification. There's just a variety of places to go.
Sonia?
I think Ben nailed it. It is going to grow over time. I think there are a lot of people that are getting hands-on experience with samples or development environments inside the organization to have a play with some of these technologies, but to some extent, we're going to learn the lessons along the way, right? So we are learning, we can base off prior experience with what we know for good application architecture, resiliency, security, all of those things. But the actual lessons particular to these different AI workloads, we are going to learn along the way. I think we just need more experience in bigger industries. And I'm going to kind of expand the bubble on that then and say, where are the resources that are outside of your organization that are also AI friendly? So Discord servers, different discussion forums. You're not the only organization that's building AI workloads, and within the boundaries that you can talk about what you're working on that's not commercially sensitive. There is a lot of knowledge sharing going on inside communities at the moment in relation to AI workloads. So I think ultimately we have a bigger center of excellence, which is the community sharing knowledge with each other across different organizations. And I see a microcosm of that happening in the FinOps world, where we talk about how AI has an impact on cost optimization and cost topics.
And that's a really good point Sonia's made. One of the things in our role of cloud advocates is we sort of interact with various technical communities around the world. And to a certain extent, that is our center of excellence for a lot of these topics, because as we always say, the people that use your products often know more about the products than some of the people in the product team. Why? Because they've gone and stubbed their toe on using the products. And the people that have deployed these workloads have learned, wisdom comes from experience, and experience comes from a lack of wisdom. And so there really is a sort of a process through which you learn by making mistakes and learn from the mistakes of others. If you can go and watch someone else's bad example, you can go, you know what? We're not doing that. And that actually can be some fairly solid architectural guidance. Okay, so the next thing was someone wanting to throw their hat in the ring on that?
No, I'll save my comment. I think there's another opportunity to talk about it in a second.
No worries. Okay, so the next thing that we're talking about is really how the AI COE can really talk to the workload teams about thinking from the get-go about how they're going to do deployment with this workload. We've all been in the scenario, especially if you've been an operations professional, where workloads have been deployed in what might be called a piecemeal fashion. Instead of getting out the Lego, undoing the Lego packets and following the instructions, what someone's done is just they've gone a bit freestyle. And unfortunately, for many of us, it's the freestyle deployments that end up being the mission critical ones. So if you've got again, new type of workload, maybe what we can do is actually put some rigor around how we're actually dealing with these workloads. So the idea of an automated deployment pipeline, and this goes right back to the arguments that were sort of existing from the beginning about DevOps, that why you would want to automate your deployment pipelines so that you had a consistent set of deployments. You're not just sort of sitting there reading off okay, now I've got to go and deploy the SQL database. The SQL database has got to be this size, blah, blah, blah. The more that you can script it, you can tear it down, bring it back up, tear it down, bring it back up, so that if something goes wrong, you can also go and deploy more quickly. And on this slide, we've got some of the tools for Azure deployment, which includes ADO and GitHub Actions. But you also should have a CI/CD pipeline, and there's benefits to continued automation. One of the concepts we've got on this slide about these deployments is the idea of, so let's say you've got your automated deployment pipeline and you can press a button, get workload. one of the things that you should think about when you're dealing with these complex workloads is the idea of version control and traceability. Now, does either of you want to tell me why you want to have version control involved in this?
Oh goodness, it could go in so many directions. One area I'd like to also mention is around infrastructure as code. There's these new Azure verified modules that make it much easier to do things like centralized management at the infrastructure layer. That it really makes it possible to do things like version control and traceability much better because now you're using policy that can be applied across these various Azure verified modules. There's also subscription vending that makes it much more possible to do this sort of version control and traceability. But the question was why. I think with AI and the model requirements that you have and the speed of which things are changing, you need to know what versions you're on, or else who knows what's going to end up happening. The other thing is that you need to be able to deploy in a variety of different environments and different regions for things like redundancy. So version control and traceability becomes even more important along those lines.
The way I like to think of it is it's like save games, right? You make sure you've got a save game, and if you end up going into a boss fight and you lose, you go back and load the save game. So you can roll back. And when we hear about outages, we often hear about an outage occurring because someone's gone and performed a deployment or a newer version of something. And if you can instantly, and we've sort of got it on the next slide here, roll back rapidly when you've done a deployment and you've realized something's gone wrong. It's much better to have the save game option where you can load up the good last known good configuration, as opposed to we've got to rebuild this thing from scratch, because once you want to minimize the number of steps that you take that can't be untaken, especially when you're dealing with complexity. Because the more complex something is, the more there are unforeseen outcomes that you could not have predicted. That it looked all good on paper until you did it. And, as sort of General said in World War II, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And some deployments don't survive contact with the production. So the idea of being able to roll it back gives you a fail-safe mechanism for complex deployments. And it's something that a generative AI COE should be telling people. They should be providing that guidance to the workload teams of saying, look, we want to make sure that if something goes wrong, you can revert us back to the save game, not that you're going to be spending your weekend or the next week rebuilding everything from scratch because you changed something that you couldn't unchange.
And again, this feels like taking a solid foundational concept and applying it to a new thing, because rollbacks we've been doing since forever. We're used to dealing with minor and major versions of an application when code changes. But to actually get into the nitty-gritty of now, this actually applies to model versioning. And so what happens if you need to roll back a model? I'm not changing code per se like I have done in a traditional sense. So I've now got this new way of having to apply what versioning and rollback looks like.
So the next topic we've got is what the AI COE has to do with guardrails around AI behavior, and why guardrails and putting guardrails on your AI deployments is really important. To give a sort of very personal example, I've been working with creating an AI avatar chatbot, which is a version of me that people can ask questions of and get responses of. Now, the reason I had to go and put a lot of guardrails in on that one is the last thing I want is videos of me circulating around the internet saying a whole lot of things that I don't want me to say. So that's a really good example of putting guardrails around AI behavior. And there are numerous stories, some of them even Microsoft related, about AI deployments where we've done something experimentally and then the internet's got hold of it and, things have gone a bit off the rails. So that's one of the reasons that an AI COE should be thinking about that. But so it's not just reputational damage. What are the other reasons for putting guardrails in on AI behavior? Either of you jump in.
We talked about a little bit before around identity and access management and security of your data. Those are policies or guardrails that you could put in place that would span across your environments. So I think that's an important aspect when it comes to how a COE should be regulating various environments. They should provide wisdom, but also a certain amount of guardrails themselves. So there is an enforcement mechanism as well.
And one of the things that you can do to sort of check that your guardrails are working is to do a certain degree of red teaming internally of your AI workloads. Just get someone to do a sanity check of, if I throw this at it, what does it do? Does it behave like I expect it to or not? And that when you've got workload teams that are working with the workload, you can get one workload team to do the red teaming against another workload team's workloads. Sonia, have you got any suggestions in this one?
I was thinking we actually do this quite well internally at Microsoft. So we, like, in playing with AI as part of my role, there are some things that I've wanted to do that have actually been blocked because of the guardrails that we have in place, and it might seem that the thing that I'm doing is fairly innocuous. Like if I'm trying to create an agent to do something, the thing that I'm trying to get it to do might be quite simple and not very risky at all. But there's kind of the bigger picture of, if it can do this, that means it could do that, and that could be quite more sort of nefarious in terms of things like data exfiltration. So we've got some pretty good internal security policies around what we can and can't do, which is rough when you try to play with it, but absolutely there for a reason to protect the integrity of our data and our internal environments.
So the last topic we really want to address before we sort of wrap this up is around compliance. Now, one of the things that everybody's aware of is that legislatures around the world are really looking at AI and trying to develop sets of rules for how AI works. Not, because we're no longer in the world where it's just about the governance of data. As I like to say when I'm talking about this, in the past, you had all of that data there, but it was really needle in a haystack sort of stuff. Even if the data was there, someone really had to have a lot of attention to go and find something in the data that might have been problematic. With AI, you've suddenly got laser-focused attention, infinite attention. And it doesn't matter how big the haystack is, it means that the data, the interesting tidbits can be found. In fact, you can say to AI to go and look at a mountain of data and go, tell me what's juicy in this particular data. And it'll figure out in its own way of using the LLM or the AI system what would actually be classified as juicy. So you're suddenly not typing a regular expression in, looking for something and then doing it one Jenga stick at a time. You've got this infinite attention. Now, governments around the world are trying to come up with ways of saying, right, well, we don't know exactly how this works, but we're going to go and set some rules. And there needs to be, at your organizational level, some way of determining what the current rules are that apply depending on what industry you are, what jurisdiction you are, but that the COE can then turn around and say, right, every workload team needs to make sure that we've got these flags or these policy options or this ability to check whether or not we're compliant with this workload. Because when you're doing a compliance audit, it's a lot easier to go and run a policy check against a workload and have it go green, 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 green. If you don't have those policies or any way of testing those things, otherwise you've got to sort of manually have an auditor come in and check whether or not that behavior is observed. Any sort of stories or interesting observations about AI compliance?
Compliance is a moving target. That's the thing that I find fascinating about it. And it's easy to go to more traditional compliance standards like ISO or US healthcare ones like HIPAA, those kind of regulations for highly regulated industries. But I like that you mentioned governments, because I think most importantly over the last 6 to 12 months is the movements in the EU with the AI Act and the Cyber Resilience Act, both of which apply to software, and whether or not you're using off-the-shelf applications or open source projects, those software components need to be compliant with these two new regulations that never existed before. And so we certainly are seeing governments or like regions like the EU come up with these structures now to talk about all of the things that you need to consider in software, and then you need to go and figure out how to not only apply that to your workloads or make sure that your workloads are compliant if you're providing those software products, but then how do you audit for that? If someone comes along and says, tell me if your AI applications are EU CRA compliant, like, you're going to have some good mechanisms in place, which may be different from the ones you've used for your traditional other compliance requirements to be audited and actually prove, maybe it's to the regulatory authorities, maybe it's to your stakeholders or your board of directors, that you are following processes for now these new regulations.
And that's one of the things that's very challenging. If you've ever really sort of gone into this area, one of the things that you realize very fast is that the language used to write legislation doesn't easily and precisely translate into something that you can necessarily measure against the moving target of technology. So that there is always a level of interpretation, and that's how lawyers get paid. They get paid to interpret whether or not a comma means something, one thing or another. And that if you've at least got this handled by a body like a COE within your organization at sort of an oversight level, you've at least got someone sitting there thinking about it. What you don't have is engineers who tend to be extremely literal about how they interpret words, going, well, I think I'm compliant with this, and if I say I am, rather than, a COE which can take a more pragmatic approach and go, actually, we know how auditors think, or we've figured out how auditors think, and this is what we actually need to do to be within, compliance on this particular workload.
100%.
I want to also point out there's another dimension to compliance outside of the data requirements or data compliance, which is around things like sustainability and security. Both of these are beginning to see more regulation, and especially in sustainability right now. This is still a big area in the EU for sure, and so when it comes to sustainability and your workload, this is going to be a really important new area, because AI does generate a lot of energy, or does take a lot of energy to develop and operate. So these are areas that you need to know. It's an area that will continue to expand and grow as we learn more about how to manage these workloads.
And so
now you maybe want to go log into the Azure portal and take a look at my carbon report and see how the AI services turn up in my carbon report.
That's right.
And that comes back to that idea we were talking about earlier about what are you actually measuring? What are your metrics? And clearly, if sustainability is something that you need to report on, that needs to be one of your metrics. Anyway, today we talked about the role of an AI COE in AI workload operations. We talked about essentially what GenAI Ops was or is, things that you need to think about, architecture and infrastructure best practices. And we'll be actually, the next session, final session in our Learn Live series will actually be on AI workload architectures. So that's, I think, in 2 weeks. Then what you need to think about in terms of AI workload deployment and the repeatability and the versioning, what you need to think about with AI guardrails and security. And then we're also, just as we finished up on, talking about compliance, and governance. Thank you very much, Ben and Sonia. Do you have any final comments?
Sonia, please.
No, I've just really enjoyed the discussion. Like I said, I like taking the traditional and mixing it with the new and seeing how we need to apply stuff. So I've certainly learned some stuff from Ben, and I hope people have enjoyed the session.
Yeah, I did too. I really appreciate you allowing me to crash the session. I learned a lot as well. Yeah, I think we have one more session to go, and Oren, I think you're going to mention what that one is.
Yep, that's related to AI workload architectures and how the COE can basically go and find them, and some of the elements of what are really important. And we sort of talked about those at a higher level, but we'll try and get a bit more specific in the next session. Hope to see you there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Bye all.